The bus wheezed as it pulled away from the dusty station, its rusted chassis shuddering under the strain of the long road ahead. Samuel Johnson, a 67-year-old black man with silver hair and a weathered face carved by decades of hardship, sat by the window. His calloused hands, once steady with a rifle, gripped the edge of his seat, anchoring him against the storm of memories swirling in his mind. The fading sunlight caught the deep green of his eyes, reflecting a soul burdened yet resolute. He was on his way to see Thomas, his old war buddy, seeking a fragment of peace after a lifetime of loss. Most painfully, the death of his wife, Eleanor, whose gentle laughter had once been his refuge. Samuel's thoughts churned like the engine beneath him. He remembered Eleanor's warm hands on his face, her voice promising him a future they'd never had. A child, a home, a life unscarred by war. He thought of Thomas, the wiry black soldier who'd shared foxholes and fears with him, their bond forged in blood and fire. And he thought of himself, a man who'd given everything for a country that often repaid him with suspicion and disdain, all because of the color of his skin. "Why am I still doing this?" he muttered under his breath, staring at the endless ribbon of asphalt. "What's left for me out there?" Yet, beneath the doubt, a quiet resolve flickered. This wasn't just a trip to see Thomas. It was a pilgrimage to confront his ghosts, to reclaim the man he'd once been. The bus rattled on, its seats worn and patched, the air thick with the scent of diesel and sweat. Samuel leaned his head against the glass, feeling the vibration of the journey sync with the restless pulse of his heart. Hours later, the bus lurched to a stop at a desolate rest area, the kind of place time seemed to have abandoned. A flickering streetlight buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows on cracked pavement. Samuel stepped off, stretching his stiff legs, the cool night air a balm against the stifling heat of the bus. He stood alone, a tall, imposing figure in his faded jacket, his shadow stretching long and solitary. Then came the sound of gravel crunching under tires. A police cruiser rolled up, its headlights slicing through the dark, pinning Samuel in their glare. Officer Mark Thompson, a 28-year-old white man with sharp features and a buzzed haircut, emerged. His blue eyes narrowed as he scanned Samuel, his hand resting lightly on his holster. The air thickened with unspoken tension. "Evening, sir," Mark said, his tone clipped and formal, though his gaze betrayed a flicker of unease. "Can I see some ID?" Samuel's jaw tightened, but he nodded, reaching into his pocket with deliberate slowness. He handed over his military ID, its edges frayed from years of use. "Samuel Johnson, retired officer, just passing through." Mark took the card, glancing at it before fixing his eyes on Samuel again. The scrutiny was familiar, too familiar. "You're a long way from home," Mark said, his voice tinged with suspicion. "What's your business here?" "Visiting a friend," Samuel replied, keeping his tone even. "We serve together." Mark's lips twitched, a faint smirk breaking through. "This area is under a security alert. String of break-ins lately. Mostly outsiders. I need you to come with me to the station for questioning." Samuel's chest tightened, a hot ember of anger flaring inside him. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. "It's procedure." Mark shot back, stepping closer, his hand hovering near his gun. "Get in the car." The words landed like a spark on dry tinder. Samuel's fists clenched, his breathing shallow as decades of indignity surged to the surface. He'd faced this before, on dusty streets in his youth, in uniform during the war, even at home after retirement. Always the same look, the same assumption. He took a step forward, locking eyes with Mark. "You think I'm a threat, don't you? Because I'm black and standing here." Mark's posture stiffened, his hand inching toward his weapon. "Don't make this personal, old man. I'm doing my job. Your job." Samuel's voice rose, raw and ragged. "I fought for this country, bled for it, so you could stand there with your hand on that gun, judging me before I even speak. Tell me, officer, what's my crime?" "Breathing." Mark's face flushed, his grip tightening on the holster. "Back off, sir, or You'll what?" Samuel cut in, his voice a thunderclap. "Arrest me?" Shoot me? Go ahead. Prove what I've known my whole life. That no matter what I do, I'm still just a suspect to people like you. The standoff teetered on a knife's edge. Mark's finger twitched, his breath coming fast, while Samuel stood unyielding, his eyes blazing with a lifetime of defiance. Then a voice broke the silence. A burly white truck driver from the bus, stomping over with a scowl. Hey, leave him alone. He's just an old guy heading somewhere. You're out of line, kid. Mark hesitated, the interruption cracking his resolve. He exhaled sharply, lowering his hand. Fine, he muttered, but I'm still checking you out. Get in the car. Samuel's shoulders sagged, the adrenaline draining away, leaving only exhaustion. He climbed into the back seat, the door slamming shut like a judgment. As the cruiser pulled away, he stared out the window, his mind a battlefield of rage and resignation. The ride to the station was a suffocating silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Samuel's reflection stared back at him from the glass. Tired, lined, a man worn down by a world that refused to see him. His thoughts drifted to the war, to a night in a muddy trench when a white lieutenant had spat at his boots after Samuel dragged him to safety. Don't expect a medal, boy, the man had sneered. That memory gnawed at him now, a wound that never healed. Mark's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and defensive. You didn't have to turn it into a scene back there. I wasn't out to get you. Samuel turned slowly, his gaze piercing. Weren't you? Tell me, if I were a white man in a suit, would you have pulled me aside? Or would you have waved me on with a smile? Mark's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. I don't make the rules. I enforce them. Skin's got nothing to do with it. Liar, Samuel said softly, the word heavy with truth. You looked at me and saw a threat before I opened my mouth. That's not rules. That's you. Mark's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. You don't know me, he snapped. I grew up in a place where they taught us to watch out for people who didn't fit. I'm not proud of it, but that's how it was. Samuel leaned forward, his voice steady but cutting. And I grew up in a place where fitting in meant knowing my place, where uniform didn't stop the slurs, where a medal didn't stop the stares. You think you're the only one shaped by what you were taught. Mark flinched, his bravado faltering. He fumbled with the radio, turning it up, but Samuel pressed on. I carried men like you through hell, white, black, didn't matter. I watched them die in my arms, crying for their mothers. And when I came home, I got nothing but doors slammed in my face. You want to talk about rules? I've lived by yours my whole life, and they've never been fair. The radio blared static, but Mark shut it off, his hands trembling. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice cracking. An apology? I can't change the past. I don't want your pity, Samuel said. I want you to see me. Not the stories you were told. Not the shadow you're scared of. Just me. Mark didn't respond, his silence louder than any words. The cruiser rolled on, the tension between them a living thing, coiling tighter with every mile. The station, truth and reckoning. At the station, Mark led Samuel inside, his movements stiff and mechanical. The small precinct smelled of stale coffee and ink, its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Mark sat at a desk, typing Samuel's military ID number into the system, his brow furrowed. Then the screen flared to life, and his breath caught. Samuel Johnson, he read aloud, his voice faltering. Retired First Sergeant. Awarded the Medal of Honor, 1972. Saved 37 soldiers in a single engagement. Enemy ambush, overwhelming odds. He looked up, eyes wide with shock. You're him. Samuel nodded, his expression unreadable. That was a long time ago. Mark slumped back, running a hand through his hair. Jesus, he whispered. I had no idea. They taught us about you in school. The hero of Hill 47. I didn't think it could be me. Samuel finished for him, his tone flat. Because heroes in your books don't look like me, do they? Mark's face burned red, shame creeping into his features. He stood, pacing the cramped room, his boots scuffing the linoleum. I messed up, he said finally, his voice raw. I saw you out there, and all I could think was what I've always been told. Black guy, alone, late at night, trouble. I didn't even question it. Samuel watched him, his anger softening into something heavier. Sorrow, perhaps. "You're not the first," he said. "Well, I got that medal." The general shook my hand, but his aide wouldn't look me in the eye. "I've spent my life proving myself to men who'd rather I disappeared. You're just another chapter." Mark stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. "My dad was a cop," he said quietly. "He'd come home with stories. Watch the streets, Mark. You can't trust him." I swallowed a whole. Never thought to ask why. He met Samuel's gaze, his eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. I mean it." Samuel studied him, seeing the cracks in the young man's armor. "Sorry's a start," he said. "But it's what you do next that matters. You've got a badge. Use it to see people, not just shadows." Mark nodded, swallowing hard. "Let me make this right. I'll drive you to your friend's place. It's the least I can do." The drive to Thomas's house was different, quieter, heavier, but with a thread of something new weaving between them. Mark gripped the wheel, his mind racing. He thought of his father's gruff lessons, the nights he'd spent idolizing a man who'd painted the world in stark blacks and whites, literal and figurative. Now, those lessons felt like chains. Samuel broke the silence, his voice softer. "You ever lose someone, Mark?" Mark glanced at him, surprised. "Yeah, my dad. Heart attack, 5 years ago. He was my hero, tough, fearless. But he wasn't kind. Not like you." Samuel chuckled, a dry, wistful sound. "I'm no saint. Lost my wife, Eleanor, 3 years back. Cancer. She was my compass, kept me steady when the world tried to break me. Without her, I've been drifting." Mark's grip loosened on the wheel. "I don't know how you keep going. After all that, wore her this crap tonight." "You don't," Samuel said. "Not at first. You just survive. Then one day, you realize surviving's not enough. You've got to live. That's why I'm here, heading to Thomas. He's my tether." Mark nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "You're stronger than I'll ever be." "No, Samuel Counters. Just older. You got time to figure it out, if you want to." The cruiser slowed as they neared a modest house on a quiet lane, its porch light glowing like a beacon. Mark parked, stepping out to open Samuel's door. A small, unspoken gesture of respect. "We're here," he said, "and thanks for not giving up on me back there." Samuel clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Don't give up on yourself, son. That's the real fight." As Samuel approached the gate, Thomas emerged, a wiry black man with a limp, his face lighting up at the sight of his friend. Before they could embrace, headlights flared behind them. A beat-up pickup screeched to a halt, and 2 white men in hoodies jumped out, one brandishing a tire iron. "Hey, you too!" The taller one barked, his voice slurred with liquor. "This ain't your road." Samuel froze, his soldier's instincts kicking in. Mark spun around, hand on his holster. "Police! Drop it and back off now." The men laughed, the shorter one stepping closer. "Oh, look, a cop playing hero for them. What's the matter? Couldn't find a real job." Mark's face hardened. "Last warning. Drop it." The taller man lunged, swinging the tire iron at Samuel. Mark reacted instantly, tackling him to the ground, the weapon clattering away. Samuel grabbed the second man, pinning him against the truck with a strength belying his age. Thomas hobbled over, shouting, "Get off my land." The scuffle ended fast, Mark cuffing the taller man, Samuel releasing the other as he bolted into the night. Breathing hard, Mark looked at Samuel, a mix of adrenaline and awe in his eyes. "You okay?" Samuel nodded, dusting off his jacket. "Been through worse." "You?" "Yeah," Mark panted. "Thanks for the assist." Thomas clapped Samuel's back, grinning. "Still got it, huh, old man?" Samuel smirked. "Never lost it." Mark secured the cuffed man in the cruiser, then turned to Samuel. "I meant what I said. I'm done seeing shadows. You're the real deal, Mr. Johnson." Samuel's gaze softened. "Call me Samuel. And you're not half bad yourself, Mark." Inside Thomas's house, Samuel and his friend sank into worn armchairs, the weight of the night settling over them. Thomas poured coffee, his hands steady despite the years. "What the hell was that out there?" he asked. "Same old story," Samuel sighed. "Some folks can't stand seeing us breathe free. But that kid, Mark, he's different." Took a stand. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "White cop sticking up for us. That's a new one." He's learning, Samuel said. I saw in his eyes shame, then something else. Hope, maybe. Thomas leaned back, his gaze distant. You always did see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Remember that lieutenant in Nam? Spit on you after you saved his sorry ass. Samuel's laugh was bitter. Yeah, but tonight Mark didn't spit. He fought. That's something. As they talked, Samuel's mind replayed the night, the clash, the words, the shift in Mark's demeanor. He felt a flicker of pride, not just for himself, but for the young man who'd crossed a line from blindness to sight. Eleanor's voice echoed in his head. Keep going, Sam. Show him who you are. For the first time in years, he felt he had. The next morning, Mark returned to check on them. His uniform crisp, but his posture relaxed. Caught the second guy a mile down the road, he said. They're locals, drunk and dumb. Won't bother you again. Samuel nodded. Good work. Mark hesitated, then extended a hand. I'm heading out, but I like to stay in touch. Samuel. Learn more from you, if you're willing. Samuel shook his hand firmly. Doors open, Mark. Always. As Mark drove off, Samuel boarded the bus home, his heart lighter. He'd come seeking peace and found it. Not just in Thomas, but in the bridge he'd built with Mark. It wasn't the end of prejudice, but it was a start. Somewhere, Eleanor smiled, and Samuel did too.